The moment my son laughed at my old car, I thought I had never felt smaller in my own family's eyes. Robert stood beside his expensive luxury car, looked at my scratched silver sedan, and laughed in front of his friends. "Dad, seriously? You still drive that?" he said. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what that old car had carried me through. I didn't tell him how many sacrifices were hidden behind its faded paint. And most importantly, I didn't tell him what I had already arranged for the following Monday morning. I simply looked at my son and said, "Maybe you're right, Robert. Maybe it's time for something new." He laughed again, thinking he had finally convinced his old-fashioned father to change. What he didn't know was that I had already made a decision that would leave him completely speechless. 3 days later, when I pulled into his driveway, Robert was standing outside with 2 of his friends. He looked up casually at first. Then he saw what I was driving. His smile disappeared. His friends stopped talking. Robert took a few steps toward me, staring at the car as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "Dad," he whispered, "where did you get that?" I lowered the window, looked directly at him, and smiled. "You told me I needed a new car, son, so I got one. But that wasn't the real reason I bought it. The truth was connected to something I had kept private from my family for years, something Robert knew absolutely nothing about. And when he finally discovered the truth behind that car, his entire attitude toward me changed. To understand why, I have to take you back to the day." My son laughed at the vehicle that had been part of our family for nearly 20 years. "To understand why Robert's face changed when he saw my new car, I have to take you back to that afternoon when everything started. I had driven my old silver sedan to Robert's house because Dana had asked me to drop off some important documents. The car was almost 20 years old, and although its paint had faded and one of the doors had a long scratch across it, the engine still ran smoothly. I had never been ashamed of it. To me, that car was more than transportation. It had carried my family through some of the most important moments of our lives. Robert had learned to drive in that car. Millie had fallen asleep in its back seat countless times. Dana and I had taken long weekend trips in it when money was tight, but our spirits were high. So when I parked outside Robert's house, I didn't think twice about how it looked. Robert came outside wearing an expensive jacket, holding his phone in one hand and car keys in the other. He looked at my sedan, stopped for a second, and then laughed. "Dad, you're still driving this?" I smiled. "It gets me where I need to go." He walked closer and examined the scratches. "I'm serious. You should get rid of it." I shrugged. "Maybe one day." He laughed again. "One day? Dad, this thing looks older than I am." His friends were standing nearby, and I noticed them glance at each other. I could have responded sharply. I could have reminded him that the same car had taken him to school, to his first job interview, and even to the college campus where he started building his career. But I didn't. I simply handed him the documents. "Your mother wanted you to have these." Robert took them without looking away from the car. "You know, I could help you find something better," he said. "I know," I replied. "You've told me." He laughed. "I'm just saying, Dad, you work hard. You shouldn't be driving around in this." I looked at him carefully. "And what should I be driving?" He pointed toward his own luxury car. "Something like that." I smiled. "Maybe someday." He shook his head as if I were being stubborn. "You always do this. You never spend money on yourself." He wasn't completely wrong. For years, I had put my family first. When Robert needed help with college expenses, I contributed without hesitation. When Millie needed money for an academic program, Dinah and I found a way. When our house needed repairs, we handled them before thinking about vacations or expensive purchases. I never considered those sacrifices burdens. They were simply what parents did. But Robert had grown older, and somewhere along the way, he had started measuring success differently. He believed a better car meant a better life. I knew better, but I didn't want to lecture him. As I turned toward my sedan, Robert called after me. "Dad, at least promise me you'll replace it soon." I stopped beside the driver's door and looked back. "I'll think about it." He smiled, satisfied, as though he had won the argument. I got into the car and started the engine. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of Robert standing beside his expensive vehicle. I didn't feel angry. I felt disappointed. But there was something else beneath that disappointment. A quiet certainty. Robert thought he knew what I could afford. He thought he knew what I valued. He thought that old car represented my limitations. What he didn't know was that for months, I had been quietly planning something completely different. 3 days later, I would drive back to his neighborhood in a car that would make him forget how loudly he had laughed, and when he finally learned how I had paid for it, the car itself would become the least surprising part of the story. 3 days later, I woke up earlier than usual. I had barely slept the night before because my mind kept going back to Robert's words. Not because I was angry, but because I kept wondering how my son had reached a point where he could look at an old car and think he understood the person driving it. Dana noticed I was unusually quiet during breakfast. She placed her coffee on the table and asked, "Are you still thinking about what Robert said?" I looked at her and smiled. "Maybe." She shook her head. "Daniel, don't let one comment change how you feel about yourself." "I'm not," I said. "I'm just finally doing something I've wanted to do for a long time." Dana knew exactly what I meant. For months I had been researching a new car. I had compared different models, calculated the cost, checked the maintenance, and made sure the purchase would not interfere with our savings or future plans. I wasn't buying it because Robert had embarrassed me. I was buying it because I had reached a point where I could finally allow myself to enjoy something I had worked hard for. That morning I drove to the dealership. The old silver sedan remained parked at home. For a moment I stood beside it and ran my hand across the hood. I remembered the first day I bought it. Robert had been a little boy then. He had climbed into the back seat and asked if we could take it for a long drive. I smiled at the memory before walking inside the dealership. A few hours later, I walked out holding the keys to my new car. I didn't feel like a different person. I was still Daniel. I was still the husband of Dana and the father of Robert and Millie. The only difference was that I had finally decided to buy something for myself. When I arrived home, Millie was visiting. She stepped outside, saw the car, and froze. "Dad, is that yours?" I laughed. "Apparently it is." She walked around it smiling. "Wow, you actually did it." Dinah came outside and looked at me with a proud smile. "You deserve it," she said. I thanked her, but I also knew the real test was still ahead. Robert had no idea. That afternoon, I received a message from him asking if I could bring him some paperwork. I could have sent it with someone else, but I decided to take it myself. I wanted to see his reaction, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted him to understand something. When I turned onto his street, I saw Robert standing outside with 2 friends. His expensive car was parked behind him. At first, he didn't notice me. Then the new car passed the corner and entered his driveway. Robert looked up casually. His expression changed immediately. He stared at the vehicle as I parked. One of his friends whispered something to him. Robert didn't answer. He walked toward me slowly. I lowered the window. "Hey, son." He looked at me, then at the car, then back at me. "Dad, is this yours?" "Yes." He stepped closer. "When did you get this?" "Today." His friends gathered around, clearly impressed. Robert opened the passenger door and looked inside. For once, he had nothing sarcastic to say. He ran his hand across the dashboard and whispered, "This is really nice." I smiled. "Thank you." Then Robert looked at me with a completely different expression. "Dad, how did you afford this?" That was the question I had been waiting for. I turned off the engine and looked directly at my son. "That's a story I never told you." Robert became silent, and I knew that the next conversation would change more than his opinion about my car. "That's a story I never told you," I said, and Robert stood there staring at me as if those words had opened a door. He had never noticed before. He looked at his friends, then back at me. "What do you mean?" he asked. I smiled and told him we could talk later. His friends were still nearby, and I didn't want to turn a private, family conversation into a public explanation of my finances. Robert nodded, but I could see the questions building in his mind. Before I left, he asked, "Dad, can I drive it?" I hesitated for a second, then handed him the keys. He climbed into the driver's seat carefully, adjusted the mirrors and started the engine. His entire attitude had changed. The same man who had laughed at my old sedan 3 days earlier was now handling my new car as though it was something precious. He drove around the block and returned a few minutes later. When he stepped out, he handed me the keys. "Dad, I owe you an apology." I nodded. "You do?" He gave a nervous smile. "I really didn't mean to make you feel bad." "You didn't make me feel bad because of the car," I said. "You made me think about something." "What?" "How quickly we judge people when we only see what they have on the outside." Robert became quiet. He looked at my new car, then toward his own. "I guess I've been doing that." "Maybe," he sighed. "I have." His friends eventually left, and Robert asked me to stay. We sat on the front steps. He told me that after his business started doing well, he became obsessed with appearances. He wanted people to think he was successful. He upgraded his car, changed his wardrobe, moved into a larger house, and started spending money on things he didn't necessarily need. "I thought that's what success looked like," he said. "And when I saw you still driving that old car, I thought you had stopped moving forward." I looked at him and said, "Robert, moving forward doesn't always mean buying something newer." He nodded slowly. I told him about the old car. I reminded him that it had carried him to his first interview, driven Millie to school, and taken Dana and me through years when we had more responsibilities than money. That car was never a symbol of failure, I told him. It was a symbol of what we had already accomplished together. Robert looked down. "I never thought about it like that. That's because you were looking at the scratches instead of the memories." He smiled sadly. "You're right." Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "So why did you really buy this new one?" I looked toward the car. "Because I could. That's all." He seemed surprised. "That's it?" "That's it. I didn't buy it to compete with you. I didn't buy it to prove anything. I bought it because your mother and I planned for our future. And after years of putting everyone else first, I decided I could finally enjoy something." Robert nodded. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Dad, I think I owe you more than an apology." "What do you mean?" "I owe you respect," I smiled. "You don't owe me anything. Just remember what you learned." He stood up and hugged me. It was the first real hug we'd shared in a long time. But as I drove home that evening, I realized something. Robert had apologized for the car, but he still didn't know the whole truth. About how I had built the life. He thought he understood. And when he eventually learned what I had quietly done for our family over the years, I wasn't sure whether he'd be proud of me or shocked all over again. When I got home that evening, Dana was waiting in the living room. She looked at me and immediately knew something had happened. "You talked to Robert," she said. I smiled. "We did." "And?" I sat down beside her. "He apologized." Dana smiled with relief. "Good." I told her everything that had happened, including the question Robert had asked about how I could afford the new car. Dana listened quietly, then said, "Maybe it's time he understands." I knew what she meant. For years I had kept certain parts of our financial life private, not because I didn't trust my children, but because I never wanted them to grow up believing that money was always available. I wanted Robert and Millie to understand effort, responsibility, and patience. I had worked for decades, saved carefully, invested when I could, and avoided unnecessary debt. There were years when I could have bought expensive things, but chose not to because there was always something more important. Robert had seen the results of those choices, but he had never seen the process. The next morning I called him. "Come over this evening," I said. "There's something I want to show you." He arrived after dinner. Dinah was in the kitchen and Millie was visiting too. Robert sat across from me at the dining table. I placed a folder in front of him. He looked confused. "What's this?" "Open it." He slowly went through the documents. They showed years of savings, investments, retirement planning, and records of decisions I had made long before he became successful. His expression changed with every page. "Dad," he said quietly, "I had no idea. You weren't supposed to know everything. You were my son, not my financial advisor." He smiled slightly, but then became serious again. "So you could have bought a car like this years ago?" "Probably." "Then why didn't you?" I leaned back. "Because I didn't need one." Robert stared at me. "That's what I don't understand." I explained that there was a difference between being able to afford something and needing it. I could afford more expensive things, but I didn't want to spend money simply because other people expected me to. I had watched friends work their entire lives, trying to look successful while secretly worrying about debt. I didn't want that life. I wanted security for Dinah, opportunities for my children, and peace of mind. "Your mother and I made sacrifices," I told him. "But we made them willingly." Robert looked at the documents again. "And the new car?" "It's already paid for." He looked up quickly. "You bought it outright?" I nodded. "No loan?" "No loan." He sat back in his chair. "Dad, I honestly thought you were struggling." I laughed softly. "That's because I never felt the need to prove otherwise." Robert became quiet. Then he admitted something that surprised me. He had been spending money on expensive things, partly because he was afraid people would think he wasn't successful. He had even taken on expenses that made him uncomfortable just to maintain an image. I told him that was exactly the trap I had tried to avoid. You don't have to live smaller than you want, I said. But don't live larger than you can afford just to impress people. He nodded. That night, Robert left with a completely different expression. Before he reached the door, he turned around. Dad, can I ask you something? Sure. Would you teach me how you handled money all these years? I smiled. Of course. I had expected the new car to change how my son looked at me. I never expected it to change what he wanted to learn from me. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. A few days later, Robert would come to me with a business decision that could affect his entire future. And this time, he wouldn't be asking me about cars. He would be asking me whether he was making the biggest financial mistake of his life. A few days later, Robert called me early in the morning. His voice sounded different. He wasn't confident or excited like he usually was when talking about his business. He sounded uncertain. Dad, are you busy today? He asked. Not really. What's wrong? He paused. I need your opinion about something. I told him to come over. When he arrived, he carried a folder similar to the one I had shown him. He sat at the kitchen table and explained that he had been offered an opportunity to expand his business into another market. The deal looked impressive on paper, and several people around him were encouraging him to accept it immediately. But there was a problem. The expansion required a significant financial commitment, and Robert wasn't completely comfortable with the risks. Everyone keeps telling me this is the next step, he said. But I don't know if I'm ready. I opened the folder and studied the numbers. I asked questions about expenses, projected revenue, contracts, and the people involved. Robert answered each one carefully. Then I asked him the question nobody else had apparently asked. What happens if this doesn't work? He became silent. I don't know, he admitted. That's the part that scares me. I told him fear wasn't always a reason to stop. Sometimes fear simply meant we needed more information. We spent several hours reviewing the proposal. By the end, I believed the opportunity wasn't necessarily bad, but the way Robert was approaching it was dangerous. He was thinking about how impressive the expansion would look rather than whether it was financially sound. I pointed this out. You're doing the same thing you did with your car, I said. You're thinking about how people will see you instead of what the decision will actually do for you. Robert leaned back and sighed. You're right. We discussed alternatives. He could expand more slowly, test the market first, and avoid taking on unnecessary obligations. He eventually decided not to accept the original proposal. Instead, he created a smaller plan that allowed him to grow without putting everything at risk. A few months later, that decision proved valuable. His smaller expansion performed better than expected, and he had avoided the financial pressure that the original deal would have created. Robert called me after the first major success. Dad, I owe you another thank you. I laughed. Just remember what we discussed. He said, I do. Over time, I noticed other changes in him. He became more patient with his employees. He stopped comparing himself to competitors. He even sold some things he had bought simply to impress people. But the biggest change was in the way he treated his family. He started visiting Dana more often. He spent time with Millie without constantly talking about business. And whenever he came to my house, he never mentioned the price of my new car. One Saturday afternoon, he asked me to take him to the garage. The old silver sedan was still there. Robert opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. He looked at the dashboard for a long moment. I remember this, he said. You used to pick me up from school in this. I did, he smiled. I used to think you were the coolest dad in the world. I laughed. What happened? He shook his head. I grew up and forgot what mattered. He ran his hand over the steering wheel. Dad, I think I understand now. I stood beside the open door. Understand what? He looked at me and said, You never needed the new car to prove anything. You bought it because you had already proven everything to yourself. That sentence stayed with me. Then Robert asked if I would come to an important event his company was organizing. I want you there, he said. Not because you're my father, because I want people to hear what you taught me. I didn't know what he had planned. I simply agreed. A week later, I would stand in a room filled with successful people and hear my son say something about me that I never expected to hear from him. A week later, I arrived at the event with Dana and Millie. Robert had organized it for his employees, business partners, and several young professionals who were just beginning their careers. When we entered the building, I could see immediately that it was an impressive event. People were dressed elegantly. Conversations filled the room, and several expensive cars were parked outside. But this time, Robert wasn't trying to impress me with any of it. He walked directly toward us, hugged Dana, shook Millie's hand, and then hugged me. "I'm glad you came, Dad," he said. "You have no idea how important tonight is." I smiled. "Then let's see what you've planned." He led us into the main hall. After a few introductions, Robert stepped onto the stage. I took a seat beside Dana and Millie, wondering why he had insisted that I be there. Robert began by talking about his business journey, the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. Then he paused and looked directly at me. "There is one person I need to thank tonight," he said. "My father." I felt Dana's hand touch mine. Robert continued. "For years I thought success meant having the best car, the biggest house, and the most impressive things. I thought people would respect me because of what I owned." He smiled slightly. "Then one afternoon I laughed at my father's old car." Several people in the room laughed softly. Robert looked at me. "I told him he needed something better. I thought I was helping him. I didn't realize I was revealing how little I understood about success." I lowered my eyes for a moment. Robert explained how I had bought the new car a few days later. But then he made an important point. The new car shocked me, but not because of its price. It shocked me because I realized my father had never been unable to afford better things. He had simply chosen what mattered to him. The room became quiet. Robert told them about the lessons we had discussed regarding money, patience and responsibility. He admitted that he had made financial decisions based on appearances and that I had helped him recognize the difference between genuine success and the need to appear successful. Then he announced a new program his company would support to help young employees develop professional skills and make responsible financial decisions. I looked at him with pride. This was the son who had once laughed at my old car. Now he was standing in front of a room full of people, telling them that character mattered more than appearances. After the event, Robert came outside with us. My new car was parked near the entrance. He looked at it and laughed. "Dad, you know what's funny?" "What?" "The first time I saw this car, I thought you were trying to prove something to me." I smiled. "And now?" "Now I know you were proving something to yourself." I nodded. "That's the difference." He looked toward the old silver sedan parked farther down the street. "Are you still keeping that one?" "Of course." He laughed. "I knew you would." We stood beside both cars for a few minutes. The old one represented the years when I had put my family first. The new one represented the years when I finally allowed myself to enjoy something I had earned. Neither car defined me. What mattered was the life between them. Before we left, Robert put his arm around my shoulder. "Dad, I'm sorry I ever made you feel like that old car made you less important." I looked at him and smiled. "You were young. You were learning. I'm still learning." "So am I." We laughed together. On the drive home, I thought about how strange life could be. A simple joke about an old car had exposed something much deeper between my son and me. Robert had learned not to judge people by what they owned. I had learned that sometimes our children need to make their own mistakes before they understand the lessons we tried to teach them. And perhaps that was the greatest surprise of all. My son didn't become a better person because I bought a new car. He became a better person because he finally understood why. I had never needed one to feel successful. The old silver sedan still sits in my garage today. My new car sits beside it. Whenever I look at them, I don't see two vehicles. I see two chapters of my life. One reminds me of sacrifice, family, and years of hard work. The other reminds me that it is never too late to enjoy something you've earned. And whenever Robert visits, he still jokes about the day he laughed at my old car. I always laugh with him now, because that day, without realizing it, my son didn't just see a new car. He finally saw his subscribe channel for more videos